This is Audible Bleeding, the Vascular Surgery podcast. We're here to help you keep your finger on the pulse.
Welcome back to Audible Bleeding. We're here today with a special episode with Dr. Starnes, Dr. Niten Singh, and Dr. Malachi Sheahan to talk about a recent editorial that was put out by Dr. Starnes and Dr. Singh regarding vascular surgeons and surgeons' role in general in this COVID-19 crisis. Just as a way of introductions, Dr. Starnes is a returning guest to Audible Bleeding, and I encourage you to go back and listen to episode 11 for a complete intro and to hear his discussion on his military experience and entrepreneurial endeavors. Dr. Starnes is a professor of vascular surgery and the chief of the Division of Vascular Surgery and the vice chair of the Department of Surgery at the University of Washington. Dr. Singh is also with us. He's a professor and associate chief of the Division of Vascular Surgery at the University of Washington. He's new to Audible Bleeding. He's the director of the Limb Preservation Service at the Regional Vascular Center at Harborview and the program director of the UW Vascular Surgery Integrated Residency and Fellowship Programs. Dr. Singh earned his MD from the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in Bethesda, Maryland. He did his general surgery residency at Tripler Army Medical Center in Honolulu and his vascular surgery fellowship at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And we also have Dr. Malachi Sheahan, who's another returning guest to Audible Bleeding. I would also encourage you to go back and listen to his episode number 3 for discussion on mentorship and vascular surgery curriculum, along with his experience during Hurricane Katrina. Dr. Sheahan is a professor and chair of vascular and endovascular surgery and the program director for the Vascular Surgery Integrated Residency and Fellowship at LSU. So just as a way of background for this, Dr. Starnes and Dr. Singh recently authored an editorial that was put out in the Vascular Specialist as well as in SVS Connect, describing their experience with the COVID-19 virus, as well as some of the changes they've made to their service line based on insight they'd gained from the vascular surgery colleagues in northern Italy. We're also fortunate to have Dr. Malachi Sheahan here to talk to us a little about what he learned during his time in Katrina and how that can help us going forward. Welcome, Dr. Sheahan, Dr. Starnes, and Dr. Singh to Audible Bleeding.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Dr. Starnes or Dr. Singh, if one of you could just start us off and let us know, what was your inspiration for this editorial?
Thank you, Matthew. So about 8 days ago, our lives changed drastically here in Seattle. As you know, Seattle is the Wuhan of the United States when it comes to the index community-acquired case that was identified at the University of Washington. And on March 12th, only 8 days ago, our leadership made the decision to cancel all elective surgeries. And that was last Friday. And a lot has changed in a week. We initially started with just saying that we were going to do urgent cases, aneurysms greater than 5.5 centimeters or critical limb-threatening ischemia. And that rapidly changed after a few phone calls to some physicians in Italy, some friends of ours. And we've had to really rearrange the way we've approached our services in a very brief period of time. And yesterday, as we had our morning report by way of Zoom, we finished up our morning report and Dr. Singh and I said, hey, this would be really valuable information to get out there to the rest of the country, to the rest of the divisions of vascular surgery across the nation, and to help others learn what we've learned in just a week. And so that was the impetus for the letter from Seattle.
Dr. Starnes or Dr. Singh, could you summarize some of the most salient points that you learned from your colleagues in Italy and what it was that made you change your thinking?
Well, I would say that when I talked to Pier Antonio Grimaldi and Germano Melisano in Milan, they gave me some very frightening news. They said that 90% of the workload in all of their hospitals was COVID-19, and only 10% was urgent or emergent patients. They said that every ICU is filled with COVID-19 patients, that they've canceled all surgeries except for true emergency surgeries. Everyone was isolated to their homes. The only places they were allowed to go were the local pharmacy or the food market. And, they just basically said that they did not have enough ventilators for all who required them. I asked Pier Antonio what their triage criteria were, and he said that if you're 80 years or older, you're made DNR. You're not even offered a ventilator. If you're between the ages of 70 and 80 and have any significant comorbidity, COPD, diabetes, CHF, you're made DNR. You're not offered a ventilator. All others, if they're healthy, a decision is made on a case-by-case basis. And ventilators are only reserved for those people who have a strong chance of survival. So it's these are frightening times, but we have to put our faces in the fire and address this diligently and smartly, I believe. Niten, do you have any other comments?
I think that was eye-opening to us, understanding that these cases that we think of as not really elective, but they are elective. I mean, a patient with an aneurysm has probably had that aneurysm for a long time, and it's not like we ever take a patient from the clinic and crash them to the OR to go do a case. And if we kept that mentality on everything, then we realize that CLTI cases and these little dialysis cases, while the dialysis cases are a lifeline to the patient, they're probably the most vulnerable patients to be bringing into a hospital setting. And I think our job as surgeons is to really to triage patients well as far as what needs to be done and what can we do to preserve resources and PPE, because it's not today, it's the projections in a week. I mean, if you bring a patient into the hospital that requires ventilatory support or ICU support, they could potentially be exposed, or if they contract COVID-19, then they get exposed. An entire ICU team, a vascular surgery division can easily be decimated fairly quickly in that scenario. So I think this was the eye-opening thing to get ahead of it. And once we heard these statistics from Italy, we quickly acted to make the same changes. And the only case, as we said, I did a ruptured aneurysm last week. Dr. Starnes did a gunshot wound to the neck and that injured the carotid, and that was the only cases that we did.
I think there are 2 points worth getting clarification on, one of which is that we've discussed here. Our patients as vascular surgeons are the exact patients that are at the highest risk for this disease. They're all undiagnosed COPD, et cetera, and older. And so they are the patients to keep out of the hospital. But on the other side of that, the ruptured aorta and a gunshot to the carotid create a very, very specific group of patients that are okay. What about the septic feet, the CLTI with a wound, those patients that we would otherwise try to get into the OR within 24 hours?
I would say for a septic foot, you should probably be taking that patient and doing what you need to do. You don't revascularize those patients. Those patients usually need a guillotine amputation. For CLTI cases, patients with rest pain and tissue loss, again, we try to get those patients into the OR on a routine basis fairly quickly, but fairly quickly is what? Within a week or so. We're not rushing CLTI patients to the OR. We're trying to get them done expeditiously, but they're not an emergent case. And, if we're holding the line on emergent cases, that's what we're doing right now.
Mal, what is your policy at LSU now as far as the case selection and what you guys are doing? Is it similar to what they've advocated at the University of Washington?
Yeah, I think we're all trying to come to grips with what is truly an emergent case in vascular surgery. And, reading their letter, it very much elucidates it. We might get a few strokes. There may be some limbs lost over time. But the reality is, I did a bypass last week and it might have been a mistake. I occupied an ICU bed for a day and a half and the guy's still occupying a hospital bed and resources. And, we're looking to get overrun in New Orleans fairly quickly. And I think it's the time to prepare for that is before it happens, not after. So I read their letter and I really realized that I was making kind of a lot of the same decisions they are. And I think that's why it's so important that people hear from them, because we're all going to be faced with this soon, it looks like. So the quicker you come to the realization of what's really truly emergent, the better off we'll all be.
I would just chime in there that I would say that there is no emergency in the setting of a pandemic, period. The luxury of doing an emergency case in the setting of a pandemic is gone. In a combat triage scenario, Dr. Singh and I would write the letter E for expected on a patient's forehead and go on to the next patient. You just simply can't waste the resources. And that's what we're coming to. We're coming to a point where we're not going to have the resources to manage all of the patients that we're presented with. And these cases that we previously called emergencies those are patients that are probably not going to do well, and we're just going to have to accept it.
Just to add to that, and as Ben said, I use the analogy that in a wartime combat scenario, that's a surgical Super Bowl. That's where it's a surgical issue, right? These are patients coming in with penetrating injuries, and it's the surgeon's time. This is kind of the medicine Super Bowl. And our job is, I think, to preserve the PPE and avoid patients that don't need to be in the hospital, trying to keep them away and keep them safe. And, be whatever help we can be to our medicine colleagues during this time, because it's not a surgical problem. Our job is to conserve resources and keep patients out of the ICU and out of the hospital. The projections are pretty sobering. When you sit down with your hospital leadership and you look at the projections that could be happening in 10 days, in 2 weeks, it's a sobering aspect to really deal with.
I have a question, because I agree that we have limited resources, and I agree that certain things which we considered urgent before aren't in this environment. But for example, we're seeing a lot more dialysis patients coming to our ERs, even in the last week, as the outpatient dialysis centers have closed. So these patients don't necessarily need to be hospitalized, so they won't take up a vent. And they're the kind of patients that if we can get them treated and get them out back on their dialysis, there are going to be deaths from COVID, but there are also going to be all the deaths from the care that we can't give our regular patients in the same period of time. And so how do we prioritize those cases?
Well, Sharif, those are the patients that consume the absolute most in terms of resources. And so those are the patients that are going to have to be triaged. I mean, it's a simple process of doing the greatest for the greatest number, the greatest good for the greatest number. And those are hard decisions, and we're all going to be faced with those decisions.
And so what are you guys doing at your institution? Like someone comes in with a access, just put a line in them and get them out, or what do you do?
Yes. So we would, put a central line in that, or a tunneled line in that patient and wish them well. I mean, they're going to get dialyzed somewhere at some point, but we can't consume it all depends on the setting, the tactical setting. If you have all the resources in the world and all the physicians in the world, we're going to be able to manage this pandemic easily. But that's not the case. We don't have enough resources to manage all of the patients that are coming our way right now.
Yeah, I agree with that. And those are going to be the tough ones. The dialysis patients, creating a fistula, you're not going to use that fistula for several weeks. So I don't think that's an issue. But the thought of trying to maintain a fistula access is real. If you do something to maintain a fistula, that's something that potentially could be in and out. But again, consuming PPE, potential exposure to the patient, those are the patients that are probably the highest risk to contract this and have a bad outcome.
You've all had different experience working in conditions with limited resources. Can you speak to us as to how we should go about working in these settings, aside from just canceling cases? Maybe start with you, Dr. Sheahan.
Well, it's tough. I think that, listening to Dr. Starnes and Dr. Singh, the sooner you come to the reality that we're in, the better off everybody else is going to be. So do you need that PPE for whatever the procedure you're going to be doing? And it's certainly time to, I had a nephrologist call me yesterday. I want to know why we froze starting these access cases. And it's like, because they're just going to go in and out of the hospital. Well, one, you don't want to expose them to anything. And two, what if they have an MI on the table? Now you have another patient in the ICU. So I think that you really have to come to the realization a lot sooner than it's obvious that what kind of pandemic we're dealing with. So that's why I think that Dr. Starnes and Dr. Singh's story is important for all of us to hear, because most of us are a week or two away from the same reality.
Yeah, I know. I agree. I think, in working with limited resources, that I think our number one priority as surgeons right now is to conserve whatever PPE we could do and preserve our staff and our stuff. That's some of the stuff that we talk about at the UW is really trying to maintain a force that can take care of these patients. It's a reality that if these ICUs become overrun, some of our trainees may have to help in the MICU because they may become overrun and they may need help. We may have to help if need be. But I think we need to do our part by limiting the amount of patients, particularly vascular surgery patients in general, are the ones that are most susceptible to bad outcomes. And I think that's our job in this thing. It's not a surgical problem, but as surgeons, we have a responsibility to really limit the use of resources that are necessary in the future. I mean, if you watch the news, there's little ladies sewing masks together now. We're running out of masks, and this is a real problem in our country that we all just have to face.
You know, that leads to our next question is, have you guys been asked to fill other clinical roles? Because, you know, there may be a lot less vascular surgery being done in the current environment, but the workforce is going to be limited. So have you guys been asked to do other things than simply vascular surgery?
Right. So, you know, our current situation right now, Sharif, is we're not overrun, right, at this point, but we're planning on being overrun within the scope of 2 to 3 weeks. So at that time, we had 3 Zoom meetings yesterday with the GME leadership, and it's being stemmed from the internal medicine side as far as what they may need from the surgical trainees, meaning surgical critical care fellows may need to be available to staff ICUs. Our surgical residents, we're going to have to offer some surgical residents to be available in case they need ICU support. And we've decided that the ICU is probably the most appropriate setting for our trainees because they do ICU work. The medicine floor probably is not a good resource utilization. So right now we're looking at offering 2 to 3 residents to be available, but that may increase over the span of the time. The other thing you have to think about with trainees is exposure. So we had our first integrated resident test positive for COVID-19. And so he is currently quarantined. And so we've lost one resident. He's doing fine. He feels fine. He had a little bit of fevers, but overall is doing okay. But, you know, these are real things we have to think about. So we have to adjust our schedule. So what we're doing for our division is keeping at Harborview, we're having 1 faculty member on with 1 resident, and then a PGY1 as a backup, because if there's an exposure or there's multiple cases, then we'll have the PGY1 come in. We have a backup faculty member, but we're all not going to the hospital together, potentially exposing ourselves to each other, which could quickly decimate our entire presence at a hospital. So with trainees, I do think there are issues, and you have to deploy them effectively, so that if 1 trainee is in the call room or 5 are hanging out or going into that call room and people get exposed, you can knock out 5 trainees that are going to be ruled out for 2 weeks or quarantined for 2 weeks.
That sounds very similar to what we're doing here at New York Presbyterian. And we normally run 2 attendings, 2 fellows, 2 senior residents, and 2 interns for 2 teams. And we're trying to run just 1 attending, 1 fellow, and an intern, and keeping the others out, even if they're doing nothing, just on at-home call. Dr. Sheahan, can you speak to us during the Katrina episode? What was the role of house staff during that time, and were things shuffled around similarly? What do you foresee happening?
Yeah, so it's interesting because our school, probably like most schools, just pulled all medical students off of the clinical rotations. And so I was watching very closely what they would do with the residents, because I think that sometimes we undervalue, their role in all of this. And it's easy for the attending to say, oh, I got this, and send the residents home. But it sounds like nobody's doing that, which is good, because I think the experience is important. And also, our surgical teams have a lot of militaristic qualities. And I never did any military service like my colleagues here, but our system of surgical services was set up after World War II by a lot of veterans. And so what we do is very similar, I think, to how it's run in the military. So after Katrina, we were obviously isolated in a hospital by natural forces, by a flood. And so we had a team there, 2 attendings and 5 residents. And I think that structure is why we were so successful. What happens is, obviously this hopefully won't happen to other hospitals during this, but it's worst case scenario. There's no power, there's no running water, there's no lights, there's no nothing in this hospital of 1,000 people. And so now to get them rescued, you have to get everybody to the roof. Well, a lot of people can't walk, right? And so that's why they're in the hospital. So now we don't have stretchers. We're just trying to put people on sheets and carry them up the stairs, and it's 11 flights in 120-degree weather to get them to the roof, because when the helicopters came, they were under orders not to enter the hospital. The structure was deemed unsafe, so the rescue personnel wouldn't enter the actual hospital. So you had to get them up to the roof. So in that situation, what do you want? Do you want, a bunch of community doctors or attendings who have no pre-existing organization? Or do you want a team, a hierarchy? So I can turn to two residents and listen, grab a corner of the sheet. We're going to carry this 300-pound woman up 8 flights of stairs and get her to the roof so the helicopter can take them. And I know for a fact, because we had these teams and these hierarchies in place, and everybody kind of knew their role, we did so much better than the community hospitals did during Katrina. And I think, when we're overrun, it just helps to have that structure in place. I think trainees and residents especially are a critical part of our organization, and especially when we get overrun like this.
And what about on the other end of that? Are people pulling their older partners out of the call pools? Are they, anything like that?
I've thought about that. You have to be.
Well, we are the old guys
yeah,
now.
You have to be kind of judicious. I thought about telling the dean, hey, we get everybody over 65.
You don't insult him.
And I'm like, oh shoot, how old is the dean? Maybe, you got to be careful. But I think that hopefully he doesn't listen to this. Hopefully people are smart, and I have thought about it, and we have not enacted anything. I'd be interested if University of Washington did anything like that, but it seems smart to do so.
I've talked to vascular surgeons at other institutions, and I won't say which ones, but I know that there's a fairly large division, and there are a couple of people who are being taken out of the call schedule because of either comorbid illnesses or age. And so I think that is a real concern out there.
I was just going to say yesterday on these GME calls, it's, cross-sectional across the department. And at our VA, we have one ICU doctor that's 65, one that's 64. So they're in the midst of trying to see what they can do to limit their exposure or coming in. Not sure they're going to be successful because they want to come in and be part and help at the VA. And then they were talking about some other surgeons at Children's Hospital, et cetera, where somebody's over the age of 60, they're taking all of the call for the next 6 weeks for that surgeon, so that surgeon doesn't get exposed. So I do think that these are good points to bring up, because for people that are older than 60, we should be considerate of our colleagues.
Mal, there were a couple of things that you had mentioned were some lessons that you learned from Katrina. And one of the things I noticed, there are two things I thought were sort of remarkable. One was you mentioned the importance of modeling competence and optimism. And then the second was the proliferation of rumors and inaccurate news during crises. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about both of those, and we can get Dr. Starnes and Dr. Singh's insight on those as well.
Sure. Well, first to address the rumors or the so-called fake news or whatever you want to call it. But, and we're seeing it already here, right? So when things start to go bad, that's when all this stuff starts proliferating, because it seems believable. When the news is horrible every single day, then things get passed around that seem believable. And, so I'm sure you've seen the email going around that if you can hold your breath for 30 seconds, you don't have COVID-19, or you should gargle with cold water. And I'm getting this stuff from doctors, and it's all false. It's insane. And I think that, we have to put a halt on that now. We are the purveyors of real news. And we have to be, we have to stand behind science here, and we cannot be seeing, spreading these types of things around, because things are going to get worse. I mean, in Katrina, horrible stories about sexual assaults at the Superdome and at our hospital and all these things, and they were completely false. It just all seems so believable. Everybody now, it seems, in my wife's mom's group from the school, they all have a friend at City Hall who tells us this is going to happen, and everybody's got a friend at the Pentagon says that. And it's just, it's complete falsehoods. And so we just have to be really careful that we don't lose public trust here, or the trust of our colleagues or our family or anything else, and kind of stay on top of things, but don't get caught spreading these crazy things, because it's going to get worse before it gets better. I promise you that.
I would add to Mal's comments that Dr. Singh and I have experienced this so many times in the military. I mean, in a deployed situation, the rumor mill can take legs and run. And, are we going to move to this location? Are we going to move to this location? I mean, rumors can just become rampant within just a single unit. And, in that setting, cool heads prevail. And I think that a daily structure is vitally important. There have to be, we have a morning report every morning where we come together, we review all the patients together, we review the plan for the day, and then we break the meeting. And, whether you call that a morning report or a brigade update brief or some kind of mechanism whereby there is a vehicle for communication, that is vitally important because you can dispel rumors. And we as leaders, we have to maintain cool heads because, if we start to get rattled, that's when everyone else starts to get rattled. What was it that Vince Lombardi said? When the going gets tough, the tough get going. That's what we have to do as leaders in these situations.
To expand on this a little bit, anyone who's heavily involved in social media right now probably has their feed overrun with calls from doctors to the government, to the hospitals, etc., for more PPE, for more support, etc. Do you think that these posts are a good thing in helping expand awareness to the public and the governments, or do you think they're in danger of creating panic?
I think we're looking at a balance right now, right? Because we don't want panic. Nothing good comes from panic. But we do need people to take it seriously and know that the time to act is when everything seems fine. And, I'm fairly proud of New Orleans for really obeying the social distancing rules for the most part. And this city of all cities is, quick to party when things get rough. We tend to have hurricane parties, and this we're taking seriously. And I think it's a credit to people here. I didn't know that would be the case, but they are. I kind of walk outside and see, and the roads are sparse, and people are generally at home. Maybe that's because the bars are closed. I don't know, but people are generally kind of doing this. So. But it is important that we show people that this is not routine, that this is definitely a once in 100-year situation we haven't seen since 1918, right? So we have to treat it as a once in a lifetime thing and not just kind of, ignore the rules and party on the beach.
Right. I think, Mal, you're right on point. One of the things you see is that at the beginning, everyone's in denial. It's like the stages of some kind of grief, and they're likening it to the flu. It's just like the flu. It's not a big deal. And no, it's not like the flu. We don't know if it's seasonal. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have Tamiflu, and we know that that we don't understand it quite yet. We will, and there's a lot of smart people working on it, and we will. But I do think that you have to avoid hysteria, panic, and I think. And I'm not a big social media guy, but I do think that some of the stuff you have to be careful with because I think a lot of people are getting revved up about what other people are doing, and you just gotta, I think, kind of take care of yourself, your people, your colleagues at work, and your friends, and the people that are partying on the beach in Florida. You're looking at them like, what are you doing? And it's just, it gets shut down a little bit later. But these are the kind of things that I think constructive. Kind of social media is probably a great thing to just make sure people are understanding how serious this is, particularly to our vulnerable population, the parents, the grandparents of folks that we have to make sure that we protect and isolate. And, you shouldn't be visiting your 80-year-old parents right now. This is probably not a good idea for the grandkids to be going to see them. These are the kind of things I think we have to just make sure we're putting out there.
Maybe this is a natural transition point then. I think, the SVS has looked at physician wellness closely for the last year and a half, and I think there's a lot of concern about protecting ourselves. And maybe we can get your insights on best practices as far as protecting yourself, what you guys have done in light of the coronavirus epidemic, as far as PPEs. What is your routine after leaving the hospital? I know a lot of people have sort of interest in that.
I can speak first to that. I have a freshman in college right now who just came home from the University of Michigan. And she, had to take a 5-hour flight home, and she was on a plane with other potential exposed individuals coming from a college dormitory. And, she has no symptoms, but she basically is staying in the house. She goes out for walks, but she has not interacted with any of her friends. Other than on social media and on the telephone. But we're hunkered in. And what we've done for the last, I'd say, 3 weeks or so is we have our Purell hand sanitizer that we put out in the garage where we enter into the house. And I have this thing for sterilizing our phones. It's called phone soap. It's a little device that you open up like a coffin almost, and you put your phone in there and press the button. And it essentially uses ultraviolet light to sterilize your phone for 5 minutes. And so our routine, whenever we leave or enter the house through that door, is we all use hand sanitizer when we come in, and we all try and keep our surfaces in the kitchen clean with disinfectant, that type of thing. We try and keep our distance from each other, but we're a family. I mean, we're staying together, and I'm probably the biggest threat because I go to the hospital, and when I come home from the hospital, I do that routine of hand sterilization and sterilizing my phone, and then I change into a different set of clothes and just move on with our lives. That's my personal routine. I don't know about Mal or Niten.
Yeah, I would say, it's very similar. I've gotten out of wearing scrubs to the hospital. I stopped doing that when I was a resident or fellow. I think one thing we forget at the hospital, we have to gel in and gel out before we see any patient in clinic. When you walk into the OR room, you've got to gel in or gel out. There's people that were watching us for years. Like if you don't gel in or gel out, you get put on a bad list. So our habits are probably in the upper, 1% of the 1% as far as like how many times we wash our hands. We're surgeons. So, we're already kind of clean by nature. And I think that, we just have to pass those practices on to others, particularly teenagers. I think that those are the things you just got to remember is that in general, when the people were amazed that this lawyer in New York maybe, infected 50 people, but his routine probably wasn't the routines that we have. And I think everyone is starting to learn that, I heard something that this may eliminate the flu in the future because people are going to be so clean and washing their hands, which is the same way the flu gets spread. But I do think that we have to continue to show these lead by example. And I think that's an important aspect that we all have to do. And just wash your hands, just stay clean. And I think that's the main thing. And I think the scrubs, if you're wearing scrubs from home to go into the hospital, you probably shouldn't be doing that. And, just get some scrubs in the hospital, change out of them. If you need to take a shower in the locker room. But whatever you have to do to just, just the perception of a doctor walking back home in his neighborhood in his scrubs is probably not a great idea at this point. People probably be a little nervous about that.
We're all turning into Howie Mandel.
Maybe not so bad.
I just want to know all the times I've been cited for kind of having my mask half off and putting it back on by the hospital. Can I now be recognized as the hero that I am? I think that's long overdue.
You deserve a statue out front.
Or maybe just take those citations off my record. I was a visionary.
Well, soon we're about to all be doing it with our wild, wild west handkerchiefs. But Dr. Sheahan, maybe you could comment on protecting one's families during all of this time.
Yeah, I think that one thing I noticed, especially during Katrina, and so hopefully, again, we're not going to get to that point, but there have been some hospitals talking about going on lockdown and keeping doctors in. And whether we get to that point or not, I'm not sure at this point. But the thing I saw in Katrina is that you have to kind of take care of your family. If you're in the hospital on lockdown and worrying about what's going on at home or the status of your family, you absolutely cannot do your job. It sounds obvious, but the pull to kind of protect your family when you're locked away from them is indescribable. When Katrina happened, we had a newborn at home. And luckily, my mother-in-law was still there. And my mother-in-law came up to me about 2 days before landfall when I really didn't seem like a big thing to me. And she's like, I'm leaving. And her heavy French accent, I'm like, you don't argue with my mother-in-law. So I'm like, okay. And I said, could you, take Claudia and the baby? And she's like, fine. And she put them all up in the car and she left. And then that was probably the best thing that happened to me because I knew they were safe. And then when the storm hits and everything happens and, just knowing that they were safe let me do my job. And so many people in the hospital had, pets at home or family they were worried about. And that pull to get out and try to figure out and protect them, it's all encompassing to most people. So, if you're going to go in a lockdown situation for any particular reason, you absolutely have to have kind of your family in a nice, safe, protected place, or it'll drive you insane.
So maybe on the wellness, are there any other resources available out there? I mean, I think SVS Connect has actually been very useful in this time. People sort of, when things are going on that you don't really know about, but you want to ask your colleagues across the country, it's a great resource. Are there any other resources you might recommend for vascular surgeons, because we're facing a big, real unknown here, both in terms of clinical issues and personal wellness issues?
Yeah, well, we started the peer support calls, and they're going to continue. And obviously, this is probably going to be part of that because it's what's on everybody's mind. And so we're talking about additional calls. So stay connected to the SVS Connected. We are trying to work this out. It's hard because we're at such a fledgling point in this whole peer support business, and now we're faced with a pandemic, and so still trying to figure out what the best way to do peer support is. And now we're faced with an actual emergency. So who knows? Maybe this will be the time to galvanize us, and we kind of figure everything out. But the SVS does want to be there for its members, and I think more is definitely coming very soon. But it's important that whatever we do is kind of in a positive way and helps people, rather than something that's untested or could even be harmful.
And I do have one more question, and I'm not sure necessarily that we are the right people to answer this because we're all academic surgeons on the call, but I know that a number of private practitioners are very concerned because if they go a month or 2 months without having any revenue, which is what's going to happen, they're going to have to lay off people, and their practices are going to be significantly affected by this. I don't know if there are any resources or, there's talk about supporting industries like the airline industry and the hotel industry, but there are going to be a lot of private doctors out there who are going to be really hit hard by this period.
That's an excellent point. Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's a really good point. When I was in the military and would get deployed overseas, they would always have to backfill my position with a reservist. And that reservist vascular surgeon would come from somewhere in America, but their practice would essentially die. Because if they're not available and they're not getting referrals and not doing cases, they would go back after 6 to 12 months and they would basically have to rebuild their practice from scratch. And so this is really going to affect, I think, the private practice vascular surgeons much more than it will affect us.
I agree. We're academic surgeons. We're somewhat protected or not in that world, but it's a real issue that's going to come up to many people. Just watching a blip on the news yesterday, they showed somebody who was an eye doctor. I don't know if it's an optometrist or an ophthalmologist, but was laid off from the eye center that they worked at because of this COVID-19 and nobody coming in and having to file for unemployment. These are real deals. This is going to happen. I think one of the things that would be encouraged is probably that it looks like there are some forums being put together on SVS Connect and other places where people could discuss this and at least commiserate and identify plans. Because at the end of the day, we as vascular surgeons are a small community, but we're a smart community, and we deal with things that we have to adjust for intraoperatively as well as patients and deal with tough things. And we can figure out some solutions, but it'd probably be good for these forums to be happening so people could try to figure these problems out together.
And on the other end of that, a lot of our listeners are also trainees. And I've already been hearing some chatter on some of the social media sites about trainees worried about getting their case numbers, not being able to operate for the next 4 months. And then even more scary is concerns about hiring freezes. Any thoughts to that?
Well, the case logs we're going to work out, and the Vascular Surgery Board, the American Board of Surgery, ACGME are all coming together on this. And there is no plan for anybody to get penalized because of this. So that shouldn't be a concern. We're going to figure out a way through that requirement and make sure that to the extent possible, everybody really finishes on time. So it shouldn't be a prominent concern for trainees right now when there's so much else to worry about. They're going to be protected to the extent we can. There was the second part to that question though, no?
The concern for hiring freezes at hospitals as they're going through crisis.
My guess is hospitals will want all the workforce they can get. Unfortunately, it's a little bit of black humor, but
Yeah, there's always jobs for vascular surgeons, and I would very, very much doubt that that's going to change. And if anything, this backlog of cases is going to even drive up the need for vascular surgeons. I would be shocked if there was a poor market once this all clears up for vascular surgeons. I think that there just is no shortage of jobs to what I can tell for vascular surgeons in the United States.
The one thing I would add for trainees is that I think our job is to maintain an environment of positivity and watch the ingenuity of some of these trainees as they start to develop Zoom applications, as they're working on potential academic projects during this time, as they're understanding, resource allocation and really just stay in touch with the trainees and just keep everything as positive as possible, because there is no playbook for this right now. The ACGME, the ABS, everyone is trying to figure it out. And I think, like we said, there's a lot of smart people trying to figure this out, and nobody wants to see people adversely affected training-wise from this. And we will figure it out, and there will be solutions. And at the end of the day, we're going to be better, and we're going to come out of this better, and we'll probably be more efficient in some of our practices that we do, some of the dogmatic practices that we've done in surgery since before we even started training. Will probably be pushed aside a little bit, and more efficient processes will be in place. And I think a lot of our trainees are looking into this and looking into ways that, how is this affecting them, and, writing up experiences. And I think this will be the playbook for the future generations.
That was a great summary, Niten. And maybe I can ask from each of you things that this is obviously a very challenging time, but maybe things that you are optimistic about, or things that you found uplifting about this experience that that we can leave our listeners with as a final note. Maybe Mal, some of the stuff that you found that you experienced Katrina, really that I found it very uplifting when you would talk about your experience then.
Yeah, I guess that I think what you're going to see is how well people come together here. I wasn't only Katrina, I was at the early rescue efforts in September 11th too. And, just the way everybody came together for that. And one quick anecdote again from Katrina, just kind of showing you how things maybe aren't as bad as they always seem, even though they can get quite bad. And, a few days after Katrina, FEMA had pulled out of the city because they decided that the city was too dangerous. And so we're sitting there in this hospital, and all the rescue stopped. And so now we're just kind of stranded there, no power, no water, no sewage, no nothing. And it was very kind of depressing. And the trauma surgeon and I had taken us sleeping on the roof because it smelled so foul in the hospital, slightly less foul on the roof. And the next morning, there was like a nuclear explosion in the distance. And it turned out it was a kind of a chemical power plant that exploded. But at the time, it looked like the end of the world. And the sky lit up, and you could see out. And it's this crazy thing. And then as that fades, you could look over the city, and there's unattended fires everywhere. And then you look down, and what used to be kind of clear water, I remember I saw a catfish swimming in the parking lot 2 days earlier. It just looked like oil. It looked like we were sitting in the middle of an oil field and with fires all around.
This is like the ninth circle of hell is what you're describing.
I'm thinking, and this is, 6 days in, so I allowed myself a little bit of negativity. And I thought, well, this is a crazy way to go, but this looks like how it's going to be. And then just as dawn hit, it was like apocalypse now times 1,000. The sky was full of these Chinook helicopters. I actually looked up what the name of those helicopters were because I knew Dr. Singh and Starnes would be mad if I called them double whirly birds. But these Chinook helicopters were everywhere. And the National Guard had been called in. And just when I allowed myself, it sounds silly, but I allowed myself just a little bit of negativity, and it was all over. And within that, 24 hours, we had the hospital completely evacuated about a week after it started. So things turn quickly, and I guess is what I'm saying. It looks like the end of the world sometimes when you're in the middle of these things, but things can turn fairly quickly. We may face these waves, and the waves may die quickly too. And so it's just you never want to give up hope. You always want to model professionalism, confidence, optimism, and just work through it because things get crazy, but you don't want to get crazy with it.
That was great, Mal. I think that I don't think I can really add. Dr. Starnes, do you have anything to add at this point?
Well, that's hard to follow, but these types of situations, these types of situations definitely bring people together. I didn't know that Mal was a first responder on 9/11, but I was too. I was at Walter Reed at the time and was actually the only surgeon. I was a fellow at the time, but I was the only surgeon that had mass casualty experience from my time in the war in Kosovo in 1999. And I was dispatched to the Pentagon to lead a team to treat the acutely injured at the scene. And, it seems like the world's coming to an end. I basically got on a bus and started heading through downtown Washington, D.C. And, it's gridlocked there. And the bus there's sirens going off everywhere. And there's people with briefcases and suits sitting on the sidewalk crying. And, you look around and you say, well, what the hell is going on here? So I asked the first sergeant on the bus, I said, can you get rid of all those cars in front of us? And he said, I'm on it, sir. And he basically gathered 8 other guys, and they're all in fatigues. And they started running down the middle of the street, banging on windows, telling people to move over. And it was like the parting of the seas. People started to move out of the way, and our bus just filed right down 14th Avenue and got to the Pentagon. And there's, of course, this big black plume of smoke coming out, and it's absolute chaos everywhere. And, we organized together. I grabbed people and I said, okay, you're in charge of the delayed group. You're in charge of the expected group. I put the pathologist in charge of the expected group because that seemed most appropriate. And, it was chaos. It was like stepping on a mound of ants, and you watch the ants all scatter and start running around, and then you come back an hour later and everything's organized. We just have to have cool heads in this. We're going to get through this. We live in America, the greatest country on earth, and we are going to find ways. There are going to be so many opportunities and things that come out of this that make us better. Just like Dr. Singh said, we're going to be better after this. This type of situation will never happen again. We will be able to respond instantaneously in the future to these types of situations. I'm just impressed at how they were able to do the genomic sequencing of this virus and have a vaccine within 61 days. That's incredible to me. That would have taken 5 years, 20 years ago. But we have a vaccine now that's in a phase 1 trial. We are understanding that other medications are going to be able to help attenuate the virus and shorten the infectious period. We're going to come together. We're going to solve this problem. It just is going to take time, and that's what's driving everyone crazy right now.
I agree with. I was just going to say one of the things that I think happens in these kinds of scenarios that you just heard Mal and Ben describe, 2 outstanding scenarios where people come together and figure things out. And obviously, I've had my scenarios in situations where that's happened as well. But one thing that you will see is that all lines get obscured, meaning, the petty differences you may have had with anesthesia or medicine or consulting services become obscured during a time of crisis, and people work together. And I think that is probably the biggest thing we can encourage everyone to be doing is, if you get the consult and all of a sudden medicine saying, can you admit this patient? We usually admit them for you. Yeah, we'll take it. That's us. You guys concentrate on what you're doing. And I think these are the kind of things that we have to do is the collegiality, the professionalism that Mal described too, that we have to be there and be willing to help and do our part. It's not a surgical problem, but we can take care of whatever patients are the semi-surgical patients that sometimes are on a medicine service. Perhaps we should be taking those patients. Let's let them concentrate on what they're doing and stay in the fight. And I think that's where we could really have an importance in this crisis right now, in this pandemic. But these are great examples and great stories. But I do think maintaining positivity and just staying above it. Just don't get caught up in the hysteria as well.
Well, I want to thank each and every one of you, both for what you're doing and your part for this situation, and also for taking the time to talk to us today about this very pressing topic.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that our listeners will find this very engaging and enlightening, and we really appreciate it.
Nice conversation, guys. Glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's a great service you guys are doing with the podcast to really help and keep everybody together.
Absolutely. Thank you.